Hello, my name is Devin Mulville, and this is my Language Heritage Project. I received a lot of help from my grandmother, Dolores David, whom I call Nana, which you will learn more about through this project. Before I went over to her house to learn some more about my language history, I knew that I had some distant cousins in Poland, but I was unsure with how I was related to them and if we still communicated with them. I knew that my grandma spoke Polish, but I had never heard any of her siblings or my great grandmother ever speak it. I also came to believe that my great grandma, Grandma Kerber, was the one that came from Poland, but I quickly realized that this was a misconception. Because I had never heard anyone in my family speak Polish, it made me wonder where the Polish language began to fizzle out and where English became the dominant language. So let's start at the beginning. This is the Osmolowskis, which you will be able to see there are 3 different generations of Osmolowskis in this picture. Up front, you will see Anthony and Mary Osmolowski, who are my great-great-grandparents. They came from Poland to the United States. Mary couldn't speak any English at all, and she never really learned the English language. This was because she was constantly taking care of her 9 or 10 children. She never worked because she was a stay-at-home mom, so she never really had a reason to learn the English language. Anthony, on the other hand, spoke a little bit of English because he had to communicate with his co-workers. Anthony and Mary moved around the United States from one state to another throughout their lives. They had moved to about 5 or 6 different states and basically had a child in each state along the way. The reason that they moved so many times was because Anthony was looking for a job. He had jobs such as a coal miner. He searched for gold during the gold rush and eventually found a job at Ford in Detroit, Michigan, which is where my family ended up growing up. Anthony made $5 an hour and learned a little bit of English through this job. For the most part, Polish was spoken at home in their family because Mary did not learn the English language and because Anthony and Mary's first language was Polish. Anthony and Mary ended up having 10 children, and in this picture you will only see 9 of them. Unfortunately, one of them did pass away at an early age. The children that you see in green are the ones that I'm going to focus most of my research on because these are the people that I had met or had built a relationship with in my own life. The first person is Sister Arnold. From my grandma to my mother, she was known as Sister Arnold and not by any other name. She was the second oldest daughter of the Osmolowski family. She spoke fluent Polish and English because she went into the ministry. There is where she trained and learned both Polish and English. The reason she stuck with Polish was because she wanted to communicate with her mother often, and she knew if she wanted to be successful in the United States, she was going to have to learn the English language as well. Because she became a nun, at the time it was required for nuns to also become a teacher, which I thought was interesting because it seems like teaching has been in my blood for a very long time. Sister Arnold was an amazing high school 12th grade teacher. She mostly taught drafting, and come to find out from my grandma, she actually received her master's degree in drafting. She said there were some very funny stories with Sister Arnold, especially when it came to disciplining her students. Because she was no more than 5 feet tall, Sister Arnold would either have to have the students sit down or she would have to stand on a chair to talk to them so she was at their own level. The next person in the Osmolowski family that I learned about was Ciocia Bessie. Ciocia is a Polish word for aunt. So in English, it would be translated to Aunt Bessie. But my entire life, we always called her Ciocia. This was Anthony and Mary's 3rd daughter. She is my great aunt. Ciocia Bessie also learned both Polish and English. She learned English through school, which she only made it to about 6th grade, because she had to leave school so that she would take care of Mary when she became very ill. She learned Polish through her mother and father and stuck with it because if she wanted to communicate with her mother, she would have to speak to her in Polish, just like the same type of thing with Sister Arnold. She learned English through school, and after she left school, she also learned the language through her jobs by working at the Packard plant and also as a seamstress in a curtain factory. Another one of the siblings was Uncle Zig. At least that's how he was known to me. In public, according to my grandmother, whenever people were introduced to him, he was known as Uncle Father Zig because he was a priest. He was my great uncle and went into the seminary at a very young age. He learned both Polish and English, or studied both Polish and English in the seminary. He became a very well-established priest and even got called to go to the Vatican. But when World War II broke out, unfortunately, he was never able to make the trip. He loved both Polish history and music, and he was known for talking about Polish history as much as he could. And he was also known for having one of the best stereo systems, even until he was in his 90s. He used to have us come over and listen to music and ask us about the songs and artists that he was playing. He spoke and wrote very fluently in both Polish and English because of his training in the seminary. This way you could say that Uncle Zig was basically had an academic Polish and English language, just like I have been learning about this in this course. This is also another picture of Uncle Zig, and can you believe this guy became a priest? According to my grandmother, many women tried to marry him, but unfortunately because he was a priest, he was unable to do so. He was a very smart and well-educated priest, and everybody loved him. The youngest of the siblings was Josephine Kerber. She was my great-grandmother, and to me, she was known as Grandma Kerber. She was the youngest of the 10 children and completed 1st through 6th grades. She went to an English-only school and was really thrown into the English language. She was forced to assimilate to the English language and had no support with her Polish language inside of school. She was married twice, and the first person she was married to was Joseph Spries. Joseph Spries was my great-grandfather, and unfortunately I never met him, and nor did my mother, because he died at a very early age of a stroke. He was also Polish, but he was born in Pennsylvania and moved to Detroit for a very similar reason as Anthony, so that he would be able to work in the auto industry. He was also an airman when he enlisted into the military. Joseph Spries' parents were John and Viola Spries. These people were my great-great-grandparents. They also came from Poland, just like Anthony and Mary Osmolowski. Something interesting that my grandma noted was that when they first came over to America, the pronunciation of their last name was Spries, because that's how it was pronounced in Polish. But when people said it here in America, they said it as Spries. So our last name's pronunciation went from Spries to Spries, which I thought was very interesting, going from the Polish way of saying it to the English way of saying it. How one person's name can change depending on the country and place that they live. In this picture, you will see my grandma, Dolores David, who is known to me as Nana. She was the oldest daughter of Josephine Kerber, or Grandma Kerber. She lived with her grandparents, Mary and Anthony, upstairs, while Mary and Anthony lived downstairs. She used to go downstairs all the time to talk to her grandma, which she had to speak to her in Polish, because that's the only language that Mary knew. So it was interesting to see how my grandma's native language was actually English, but she spoke Polish most of the time because she wanted to communicate with her grandmother. Nana actually went to a Polish school from 1st through 8th grade. She was forced originally into the school by Grandma Kerber, but she ended up loving the school and loving learning the Polish language, so she stuck with it. She was the only one of her siblings that really stuck with learning Polish. Everyone else went to the Polish school for only a couple of years. My grandma described the Polish school as having a Polish book while also having an English book, so they were learning both languages at the same time. It was interesting to find out that there was a bilingual education even going on in the 40s. So it's wonderful to see that something that happened years ago is still going on today, so that students and children can learn multiple languages at the same time. My grandma ended up having 3 daughters, one being my mother, Erin, and her 2 sisters, which are my aunts, Susan and Patricia. It was funny to hear that my grandma, Nana, and my great-grandma, Grandma Kerber, used to speak in Polish sometimes. And the reason they would speak in Polish was so that my mom and her sisters could not understand what was going on. My mom and my grandma both said that it would irritate my mom and her sisters when they couldn't understand what was going on. So this showed me that this is really when the Polish language was not learned within my family. I've never heard my mother or her sisters ever speak Polish, unless it's a few words like cha-cha. As I mentioned before, I have some distant cousins in Poland, but I wasn't sure how I was related to them. My grandma was able to describe how I was related, but it was very confusing to try to figure out who was related to who. So all I can be able to share is that they are very distant cousins, but we are related to them. This is a picture of Yuri, which in America we would pronounce as Jerry, but in Poland it's pronounced Yuri. He was part of the Polish army and just passed away a few years ago. Yuri was married and had a couple of children. One was Agnes, which you can see pictured here. She learned both Polish and English in school because at the time, Polish and English was important to learn at school because they realized that learning the English language was going to be something that was going to be beneficial for these students to be able to succeed in the entire world and not just in Poland. So even today in Poland, you will hear that students learn both languages to help them get better jobs. Before this, Yuri did not learn English at all, which you will see later through his letters. The only language that he speaks or spoke was Polish. Agnes ended up studying to be a translator, which she went to a university to get her degree in. She now knows over 4 languages, including English, Polish, and Italian. We used to communicate with both Agnes and Yuri all the time, especially at Christmas and Easter. We used to send them gifts as well as they would send us gifts and letters back. This is a letter that Agnes wrote to my grandmother, which she wrote in English. This letter is describing how Agnes was in the hospital for a while when she was ill. You will see that she very clearly understands the English language and can easily write to be able to communicate between herself and my grandma. You may see that a couple words are missing, like the or a, but for the most part, she has perfect English grammar. This is a picture of a letter that Yuri sent to my grandma a few years before Agnes had sent that letter. Before Agnes could learn the English language, Yuri would be the one to communicate with my grandma, but he only spoke Polish. So my grandma would have to translate the letters to English and then write back to them in Polish. It was amazing to see just a few days ago how my grandma was able to read this letter in Polish and then be able to translate it for me in English so that I understood what the letter was all about. The only word that I was able to recognize in this letter is the word that is underlined, which is university in Polish. It was interesting to see how there are some words that you can recognize because they are closely related to English. But it seemed that the Polish and English languages aren't as related as other languages, such as Spanish and English. In the pictures, you can also see Yuri and his family up top, and below that you see a picture of Agnes when she was younger, Yuri, and my grandmother when she went over to Poland to visit. In conclusion, I finally was able to discover how the Polish language disappeared. I always thought it was either my generation or my mother's generation's fault why we don't speak Polish anymore. But come to find out, it was right when, after Mary and Anthony moved from Poland to America. After my Grandma Kerber moved out of the house with my grandma and her siblings, she did not use the Polish language much anymore because there was nobody there to communicate with her in Polish. Her grandma lived in another house a few miles away, so she just spoke English to her own children. That's when the Polish language began to fizzle out. If it wasn't for my grandma going to a Polish school and sticking with it for so long, I don't know if I ever would have heard the language spoken, other than maybe birthdays, which is where you will hear the birthday song by clicking the link below. This song is a celebration of the Polish language by singing Happy Birthday, which is something we sing at every single one of our birthdays. I also realized how difficult it must have been to live in the United States, knowing very little English, as well as moving 10 kids around from one state to another. I can't imagine moving that many times across the country while also trying to learn a language at the same time. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for them. I also realized how learning English was really forced upon my family. You have to assimilate to the language of the country to be able to be successful and communicate with those people around you. If you didn't speak the language all the time, I noticed that it was something that would be lost very easily, or it would not be as strong of a language in your family because you were not consistently practicing it, which you can see with my Grandma Kerber. When she was not able to communicate to other people consistently all the time, it was a language that she began to lose. I now have a newfound appreciation for my language heritage history. I now really appreciate where my family has come, how difficult it was for them to change, and understand now how quickly a language can be lost if it is not practiced or used every day.